So welcome to this boot camp on federal contracting. I'm really delighted to have our presenters with you today. So Janet Hannum Hayes is the Director of Contracts in the Office of Sponsor Programs, and she has over 25 years of experience in research administration. And she holds a Juris Master's and a Master's of Science, and she manages both industry and non-industry contracting groups within the Office of Sponsor Programs. Also joining us today is Nikki Simmons, and Nikki Simmons is the Assistant Director for Non-Industry Contracting Group in the Office of Sponsor Programs, and she has over 20 years of experience in research administration. She's responsible for managing a team which reviews, negotiates, and executes a variety of agreements with state, federal, international, and private sponsors. And Kanika Moss is with us as well, and she is the Associate Director for Non-Industry Contracting Group in OSP with over 10 years of experience in research administration. She is a UGA alumni and a member of the State Bar of Georgia. So you all you're getting like the cream of the crop here today, right? All of these years of experience. And so they are going to share some very dense content with you. The great thing is they're here at Emory, so if you have questions after, you can reach out to them. So I'm going to start sharing the slides, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters to get started. And I think they are going to start out with some polling questions for you, so that way they can get a sense of who you are and who's on the call and who has handled what. Okay, so a little bit about you. Let's kick off here with some polls.
Right. So we just want to get a little bit more background to see who's on the call and your experience with the federal procurement process, if any at all. So
I have launched the first poll. Can everybody see that? I'm seeing responses coming in.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. There's still some responses rolling in. And it looks like you have about half and half here on the call today as far as managing a federal contract.
okay, great. So that was both poll questions, right? 1 and 2.
I'm going to get
Okay.
the second one now.
Okay.
Yeah. So second question. There we go. Whoops. Did it not launch?
Mhm.
Let me stop sharing that one. Sorry. We'll get this. There we go. That one launched. So if you worked on a submission of a federal procurement solicitation, and it looks like of those who have, a majority of them have worked on a request for proposals, and then some on a BAA, and even fewer than on the request for quotations.
Okay. So it looks like at least half of everyone has worked on a federal contract, and the poll percentage varies with respect to the solicitation then. So if you go to the next slide, we'll get us started on the federal procurement process. And so the goal is just to provide an overview of the process, which is pretty dense, but as Tricia said, we're accessible here if y'all ever have any questions, and we'll have that opportunity to address any questions at the end. So the landscape at Emory, in fiscal year 23, we once again made history getting over $1 billion in research funds, which was an increase from the prior fiscal year 22. The majority, as you'll see, was federally funded. So that made up about 64% of that $1 billion total, with NIH, the CDC, and the National Science Foundation being the top federal funders out of a list of other federal agencies that includes HRSA, the DoD, the VA, and more. Slide. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about the various federal award mechanism types that the government may issue. So the first is a grant. It's an award of assistance to support a public purpose. Then you'll have a cooperative agreement, which is a grant, but it involves substantial government involvement. OTAs or other transaction authorities. These are more defined by what they're not. They're very unique mechanisms. So they're not a grant, they're not a cooperative agreement, they're not a federal contract. They're generally not subject to federal laws or regs. And finally, you have your procurement contract. So these are mechanisms the government uses to procure goods or services for their use, and these are subject to federal laws and regs. Next slide. So we talked about the award mechanisms, and now we'll get into the solicitations that trigger them, specifically trigger the procurement contract. So the first is a request for proposal. These are used in negotiated acquisitions to communicate the government requirements for a specific project. This is distinct from a broad agency announcement, which is written broadly, as the name suggests. It focuses on advancing science. There's not a specific project the government has in mind. Then there are requests for quotations, and these outlines in specific detail a list or description of relevant parameters of the requirement. And these are generally better suited for commercial products and services. And you'll see that obviously we're a research institution, we generally perform research, but the government will use RFQs if it's a type of work they can get from any number of facilities. So if a PI in pathology is testing blood samples and just sending results back to CDC, that's something they could get anywhere, and that is why they treat it in a commercial manner. And then there's requests for information, and these are used when there isn't a present intent to make an award, but the government wants some preliminary information on price, delivery, and other market information for planning purposes. Next slide. Okay, so let's say we received an award of an IDIQ. Those are indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts. In that case, the solicitation the government will issue are called requests for task order proposals, or RTOPs. So once these are issued, the PI has the ability to decide whether they want to go out for it or not. They do not have to if they're not interested in doing so. If they are interested, then a proposal will be developed, routed in accordance with the requirements outlined in the request for task order proposal. If awarded, the mechanism will be a task order agreement, which is subject to the IDIQ contract or the master contract. It will outline the budget, specific scope of work, and any additional terms or conditions that apply to the specific projects. Internally, we treat these as new proposals and awards. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to get into the format of solicitations and contracts and federal contracts. So each solicitation is different, but generally they have three components. There's the business proposal, which speaks to the budget, as well as information concerning our organization and our qualifications. A technical proposal speaking to the scope of work and the project team, and a spreadsheet itemizing the budget. So both the solicitation and contract follow the uniform contract format, which is outlined in the regulation you see cited there. Essentially, the reg requires that contracting officers prepare solicitations and contract using the table you see to your right. So solicitations, using the uniform contract format will include parts 1 through 4, but the resulting contract will not include part 4. It is retained in the contract file. Okay, so part 1 of the uniform contract format is the schedule. So this will include the first page, which is the contract form or solicitation form. It has a signature page and basic award information like the contract number, addressee information, the contract amount, etc. And then there's the supplies or services and prices or costs. So this will outline any plans or contract line item numbers, listing deliverables or services that are expected to be delivered to the government. It can also provide a high-level overview of the purpose of the contract and outline the budget. This will also detail the work statement, which will be the SOW or statement of work, and it will incorporate the proposal that we submitted. And it describes each client in detail so that both the government and Emory are clear on what's expected in our performance. Packaging and marking, this describes the packaging and requirements for any deliverables. So if we're supposed to mail a report, for example, what that's supposed to look like when it gets sent to the government. Next slide. The part 1 also outlines inspection and acceptance. So it outlines the government's right to inspect services and deliverables, the manner under which such inspection shall occur, and what happens if services are not accepted. So we didn't conform to the requirements of the contract. It also outlines the period and place of performance, scheduled deliverables, and the format of deliverables, and to whom those deliverables should be sent, and any contract administration data. So it will identify the contracting officer representative or core and the contracting officer, any invoicing instructions, key personnel in the contract, and just details the overall management of the contract. Finally, part 1 will include any other requirements that don't fit neatly into what we just got into. So that could be background investigations, if that's required under the contract, Section 508 requirements, which we'll get into, travel requests and procedures, security management, and more. So Section 508 under the Rehabilitation Act requires that any electronic products that we deliver to the government, we must ensure that they meet certain accessibility standards outlined in the Act so that both federal employees with disabilities and those without disabilities can similarly access that deliverable or product. And this also applies to members of the public seeking information from the federal agency. So as a result of this requirement, we have developed a template which will be submitted as part of the proposal package. And should we receive the contract, the PI would just work with Mark Overcash to ensure any deliverables meet the accessibility standards outlined in the contract. Another special contract requirement could be the past performance. So some solicitations require information concerning our past performance under awards, and these are usually federal contracts of similar scope or relevancy, and this will act as an evaluation factor for the government to determine if we would be able to perform the requirements of the pending contract successfully. So this requirement can include a narrative, a description of the prior contract, including details like the awarding agency, the contracting officer name, period of performance. And it could also require that we submit a questionnaire to those past performance references as part of our proposal submission. And to your right, you'll see an example there. Okay, and so as we get into part 2, Janet will dive into that section.
Janet, before you start, I just had a quick question about that 508 statement. Is that something that you share as needed? Is it something that's found on your website?
It's definitely something we share as needed. And so once we review the solicitation to determine if it's applicable under that solicitation, we'll have that discussion with the project team as part of our kickoff meeting. And we're going to talk a little bit about that.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely. All right, so you've heard Kanika start talking about the various different types of solicitations that we can encounter. She started us walking through the solicitation components. We've talked about part 1, and now let's talk a little bit about part 2. And it's important that we're sharing this information with you because ultimately each part of the solicitation translates to the contract that we're actually going to get, right? So in part 2 of that solicitation, this is where the contract clauses start to be spelled out. And this is driven under the Code of Federal Regulations, specifically Title 48, that dictates that the Federal Acquisition Regulation System is what is to be used by the government when they're procuring these types of services or goods. Under Chapter 1, which is where the Federal Acquisition Regulations lie, that document governs, again, the way the government conducts business. All contracts won't necessarily have the same FAR clauses per se, right? It'll depend on the type of contract that you're getting. So in a cost reimbursable contract, there could be additional FAR clauses that are included different from a fixed price type contract. Also, the type of work that we do can dictate the type of contract clause that's included. You know, if we're doing R&D, there are specific FAR clauses that are included to address that type of work, different from if we're providing services or supplies for that matter. The type of institution also dictates the type of FAR clauses. There are clauses that are specific to for-profit entities that could do work with the government. And of course, you know, agencies like ourselves who are nonprofit educational institution. So part of our charge is to make sure that the FAR clauses that are included in the final contract align with us, Emory, the type of organization that we are, the type of work we're doing, et cetera, et cetera. Also, the contract amount can trigger specific FAR clauses. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in detail as we move forward. Some of the most recent, next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you go back one? Let me make a quick point about these. So I talked about the FAR governing the contract clause, right? But it is absolutely possible that depending on the federal agency that we're working with, additional FAR clauses can be included. So for example, if we're pursuing a Department of Defense contract, we not only have to grapple with the FAR, but we have to also grapple with DFARS that's specific to the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation. Similarly, if we were doing a contract with the Department of Health and Human Services, the HHSAR clauses would also be added in addition to the FAR. And as you can see, same for any agricultural acquisition or GSA or Department of State. So keep in mind that while the FAR is the governing mechanism, and there are base clauses that would be applied depending on the type of contract that you have or the type of work that you're doing, you could also be subject to additional FAR clauses that are specific to the agency that we're working with. Next clause or next slide, please. So there are some FAR clauses of late that are sweeping the nation. One of which is this FAR 52204-24, and there's a 25 and a 26. And this clause basically is a prohibition on contracting for any telecommunications and video service equipment or services. Essentially, the clause bans contractors like Emory and any other institution from using any telecommunication equipments that is coming from certain Chinese corporations, right? Per the government, we can neither use those funds to purchase those types of equipment to use it for the project, nor can we, as an institution, have as part of our repertoire, as part of our standard infrastructure, those types of equipment here at Emory and utilize them on the project. And so if an offerer does intend to use one of those equipments, which I will tell you, we as Emory will greatly discourage, it means that we would have to provide certain additional disclosures and attestations to the government that could be long drawn out and very complicated. And let me just emphasize that there was a point in time where Emory did maintain equipment that fell within this category, and our central IT unit in the institution had to work very quickly to make those corrections and submit our attestation to the government that we're in compliance so that we can continue to receive and pursue federal contracts. Next slide, please. The next popular slide that has hit the nation of late, and that does impact us here at Emory, is FAR 52-204-27. And this clause is known as the TikTok ban, right? I'm sure that some of you who have started to work on your federal contracts may or may not have been tapped by some of us within the last few months because some of your investigators had to make this attestation because this clause was included in their contract. Basically, the clause says that it prohibits the presence or use of any covered ByteDance application. And ByteDance is, think about it like as an umbrella. There are various different applications under it. TikTok is but one of them, right? You cannot have any of those applications on any equipment that is going to be utilized on a federal contract. And so Emory, as an institution, we're prohibited from using it. This means the PI can neither have it loaded on his or her equipment, and more importantly, if the investigator or any project team for that matter is going to access any project from his or her personal phone, your personal phone cannot have any TikTok application on it. So the clause is pretty serious. As I said, it's sweeping the nation, and many institutions are grappling. How do you manage that, right? Because it's one thing to shut down the institution equipment, but it's very hard to monitor, any bring your own device that investigators and projects teams uses. But I will say that Emory has established a process where we will work with Emory IT Enterprise and the PI. We must obtain certain attestations if the clause is included in our contract. And so, as I said, we have a process in place that we're rolling out to be able to address that. Next slide, please. So there are also sections in the solicitation in Part 2 that speaks to exceptions to the terms of the contract. So oftentimes the solicitations would indicate that by signing and submitting the proposal offer that we're making, we're agreeing to comply with all terms and conditions that are outlined in the solicitation that will ultimately translate into the contract, right? So with that, it's incumbent that OSP reviews the solicitation carefully. And we provide a document that's outlining any exceptions that we're going to take to the solicitation or beforehand, and we include that as part of our proposal submission. So the contracting officer can see that, okay, they've made it clear that they're not going to be able to agree to this should they get a contract. And that's what will help dictate some of those negotiations. Some of the things that we often need to take exception to are clauses or requirements relating to IT security. And we'll typically, when we see that kind of requirement, we'll tap Emory IT, LITS in particular, talk with them, and if they say no, we absolutely can't. So for example, one of the bigger clauses are FIPS and FSMA. FIPS and FSMA is the National Institute Standards of Technology, right? And so we might be told we can't agree to this, or we can't agree to all of it, depending on the requirement that's under that. Because remember I said, the clauses are broad scoping, so we have to think about what lane do we fit in. As an academic institution, we can do but so much, different from perhaps a for-profit entity that may be able to encompass the entire or adhere to the entire clause. So again, those are some of the clauses that we often need to take exception to. The other one to the far right is that termination for convenience. That is oftentimes included in the contract, and we have to ask for that to be removed or replaced. And you can take a look there once you guys get the slide and read some of the rationale as to why it is we would want to negotiate out or take immediate exception to clauses that say terminate for convenience by the government. Next slide, please. So we're moving along. Let's look at part 3 of that solicitation. And in that section, it outlines things like the list of documents and exhibits and all of the other attachments that we're required to include as part of our proposal. So that section could include a variety of different pieces of work, like the statement of work, right? The government might give us a brief statement of work. This is what I am expecting you to do. Again, depending on the type of solicitation. If it's an RFP, that SOW might be a little more detailed. If it's a BAA, might be a broad concept, but it's going to sit there in that SOW that's included within part 3. The other thing that might be included is a small business subcontracting plan example and or requirement. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. There could also be requirements where non-disclosure agreements are going to be required as part of the contract. That's typically seen in a lot of CDC solicitations. This part 3 will also provide information or instructions to us on the contract data requirements, right? If there's data required to be delivered to the government, that section will dictate to us specifically the format that it needs to be submitted in and the frequency. There is also information about CPARs, and Nikki is going to give you a little bit more detail about CPARs later in the presentation. But then there are also additional security requirements that may be subject to this solicitation. And again, all of this is found in part 3 of the solicitation. The other standard documents that are often also required of us to submit as part of the proposal packet are things like qualifications of offerer, right? And I will say that OSP maintains some stock language that we can share with each project team. And that stock language is basically talking about Emory's capability, right? It talks about all of our buildings, all of, you know, the various different hospitals and our relationships that makes Emory a great institution to potentially pursue this. But the qualifications of offer instructions could also require that the PI gives some personal experience in the research area that he or she is pursuing, right? We also need to include certificate of current costs that solidifies the budget that we're proposing. We're often required to include audit reports, obviously a cover sheet to the proposal. We're required to include various different policies like our travel policy, In some cases, our merit policy, how do we promote that sort of thing? We have to obviously provide documentation supporting our proposal costs, right? So you can't just provide the budget in some cases. If the instructions are explicit, you might need to provide quotes, invoices for anything that you purchased or that you are attempting to purchase. And of course, we always need to provide our F&A rate agreement. We also are required to include our DS2 disclosure statements. Obviously, bio sketches are also required. Other support is also required. There's typically also a data management plan that is required, and much, much more, but it's all outlined within the solicitation, right? Clear instructions for us to pursue and follow. So you heard me talk about the small business subcontracting plan earlier. Let's dive into it a little bit more. Federal law requires that any recipient of a federally funded contract, right, that exceeds the threshold or meets or exceeds the threshold of $750,000 or more, that they have to commit to spending a percentage of those project costs with specific vendors that qualify as small businesses, right? This is dictated and outlined in FAR 52-219-9. So if that FAR clause is in your solicitation and your budget for the overall contract or proposal is $750K or more, you're required to include a small business subcontracting plan. And the rationale for this is that the government wants to prioritize small businesses, right? And give them an opportunity to, participate in the federal procurement process. And this is how they're able to do that. So the small business subcontracting plan is a purchasing plan that we have to draft and develop, right? And it prescribes the percentages of costs, as I mentioned, that we would need to expend with different phases of small businesses. Now, the general categories, and this is typically found in most HHS type solicitations. So this is typical in NIH, it's typical in CDC, but it is not unheard of that a solicitation can change these percentages, right? It is squarely at the contracting officer and that contracting group's purview, but this is the recommended percentages coming from the SBA or Small Business Administration. And so it's saying here that, we would have to commit to spend at least 32.5% with small businesses. So within our budget, whatever it is that we're buying, we need to specifically seek out small businesses that we're going to expend that from. We'd have to spend 3% of or with veteran-owned small businesses, 3% with service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, 3% with hub-zone businesses, and then the last two is 5% with small disadvantaged businesses and 5% with women-owned businesses. Next slide, please.
I have a quick question on this slide. So is this
Sure.
a plan that an investigator will work with purchasing on?
So it is, and I was about to get into that on the next slide.
Oh, okay.
No worries. So OSP works with procurement to draft and complete that plan, right? We require that the final budget be provided to OSP. And let me reiterate this, that the plan, once you draft it, it's based on the final budget. It's going to be included as part of the proposal. So we can't draft the plan on a near final budget or a draft budget, right? It has to be the final budget. And the budget, when you provide it to us, has to be in a specific format that's outlined here. Each of those categories, the other direct costs, supplies and materials, travel, subcontractors, consultants, equipment. For those of you who've had experience working on some of these RFPs, you know that when you send us those budgets, we literally want to know how many pencils you're buying, right? How many test tubes do you need? Who are the subcontractors that you're working with, right? What other direct costs on a line item basis are you intending to purchase? Because then we have to meet with procurement and we go through procurement's small business database and they identify for us whether or not there are vendors that can do these things, right? In some cases, we might need to, or procurement might need to get a request for quotation from some of those vendors to solidify that they understand that they're going to participate on this contract and that they're going to be the provider so we can commit this in the plan. So needless to say, it's an extensive process and it takes a lot of time, which is why we will continue to stress this is not a grant and we need time and more time to be able to develop because the proposal preparation expands and has a lot of stakeholders across the institution. So once we are awarded, or if we're awarded, OSP would then notify the procurement office because they are charged with the responsibility of reporting on a quarterly basis to the Small Business Administration and the government, the contracting officer in this case, as to our compliance against that plan that we submitted. All right, we're moving through the solicitation. We're now in part 5. Part 5 talks about reps and certs, right? Specifically, section K is a requirement that we're going to make certain representations and certifications and other statements on behalf of the institution. Now, most, especially of late, most solicitations will permit or allow acknowledgement that we've updated our reps and certs and SAMs. And I will say this, that within the last couple of years, there's been a shift and a move by the government that every institution, for profit and otherwise, needs to maintain their presence as an entity in sam.gov, in order to be able to do work with the government. So Emory maintains its certifications there, but it is not unheard of that a solicitation will require both. So they not only want to be able to know that it's in SAM, but they'll actually provide reps and certs forms that we'll have to complete separately and include as part of our proposal. And OSP handles those aspects of the reps and certs assertions. Section L provides additional instructions to us. It'll, let us know specifically how the proposal needs to be submitted. So it could be submitted, it might need to be submitted via electronically in the ECAPS system, right? Or it might need to just be submitted to the contracting officer. But section L is where we're informed explicitly as to the method of how the proposal needs to be submitted and the specific format that it needs to take, right? It could, most solicitation says you need a technical and a business and then the additional spreadsheet. But if you're doing an IDIQ that also has some task orders, it could get very complicated to know how many packets you're submitting. Section L will help provide that information to give some clarity. Section M is very important as well. And it's important to the investigators. And I would say to Raz to really review that section, because that section identifies all of the significant factors and sub-factors that they're going to consider in that proposal in order for us to be awarded. So the investigators should review that to ensure they're hitting every one of those things that they are looking for as a marker to ultimately award that contract. And now that we've talked about the solicitation and gone through each of its parts, let's talk a little bit about the proposal submission process in detail here at Emory. If you would move to the next slide for me, Tricia. So again, if I didn't say it before and clearly, this is not a grant. I repeat, this is not a grant. And so with that, once the investigator decides that he or she is going to pursue or planning to submit a proposal to an RFP or a BAA or any one of these solicitations, we ask that he notifies RAS or she notifies RAS as quickly as possible, and RAS reach out and notify the applicable contracts analyst as soon as possible. Even if you don't yet already have started the routing, but if you have knowledge of an RFP, please notify us. And part of that reason is, as I mentioned before, some of these proposals may require an electronic submission through their portal. So we have to add buffer time, right? Because remember, we're going to be doing an outline for all of you. We're going to be scheduling meetings, all these things we need to plan accordingly, right? As I said, OSP, once we're notified, we'll develop an outline. So we take that solicitation and we review it and we create or translate into an outline that itemizes all of the requirements of the solicitation. We'll identify deadlines, we'll identify the submission format for you, any specific proposal requirements, and most importantly, we outline the roles and responsibilities between PI, RAS, and OSP, right? We'll convey that outline in an internal kickoff meeting that we will schedule with all of the relevant stakeholders. And again, having read the solicitation, we'll be able to determine, is this going to be over 750? Do we need to include procurement in this conversation? Does this have IT requirements? Do we need to have Emory IT at the table, et cetera, right? So in addition to fielding any inquiries or gathering those OSP deliverables, remember I said reps and certs is something that we're going to commit to providing to you, right? So we'll outline all of those things that OSP will bring or be responsible for to contribute to you as part of the submission. But there are other things that each stakeholder has responsibility for. OSP, in the meantime, in all of this, we're also continuing to monitor SAM.gov, because that's where the agencies post the solicitation, and it's also where they post amendments to the solicitation. And if there are relevant amendments that are required to be downloaded, included, signed, and included as part of the proposal package, or amendments that changes anything in the proposal, which happens all the time, we're monitoring for that so that we can include, add, and notify everybody of these amendments. The final package, as it will be submitted to the agency, will be RAS's responsibility to put together. We ask that the final submission be provided to OSP in the time frame in which we'll outline for you in the outline document and discussed in the kickoff meeting, so that we can ensure that OSP submits the final package well before the deadline in whatever manner the solicitation is requiring. So, as you know, we do a lot of RFPs here, and we do it with subcontractors where we're including other third parties to collaborate with us. And if that is the case, to the extent that we are engaging any of our subcontractors to be a part of our proposal, think about it this way. These subcontractors are effectively going to be providing their own mini proposals to us for us to include it in our packet, right? Because the government is not only evaluating Emory, it's evaluating each of those subcontractors that we're identifying that we want to include as part of our collaboration. And so again, more emphasis here as to the reason why we have to give enough time in the preparation, because they'll need to be instructed, they might need to be included in some of our kickoff meetings, et cetera, et cetera. To the extent that we are going to be a subcontractor on somebody else's RFP, so some other entity is leading, right? We typically should rely on the prime to tell us which documents they need from us, right? But we do also want to see that solicitation. We ask that you request for a copy of that solicitation. So just because UAB is the lead and they're asking us for our, bio sketches and other support, if this is an RFP, please ask him for the solicitation. And for the reasons I cited earlier, we still need to review that and make sure that we're taking any exceptions that we need to and conveying that in our letter of intent that you'll need to include as part of your subcontract packet. And next slide, please, Trisha. So we've talked about the entire process. We've talked about the process of proposal submission at Emory. Now I'm going to turn it over to Nikki, who will talk with you about the award negotiations.
And I don't know if you wanted to address the question that's in the chat first. Can awards set up and now closeout be included in the kickoff meetings?
Oh, we're going to get to that. There is
Okay.
an entire slide that will speak to that. And let me qualify to say that there's typically 2 kickoff meetings. There is a introductory meeting to talk about the needs of the solicitation and what we're trying to do. And then once we're awarded, there's definitely another kickoff meeting. And Nikki's going to talk about that. As a matter of fact, let me just cover this slide quickly. Wow. Nikki?
I got it. I can take it.
Go ahead.
Okay. Now that the proposal's been submitted, the government evaluates your proposal, and if they determine your proposal is within their range for an award, they may select your proposal for negotiation. So negotiations often go through several rounds, and they require the submission of revised budgets and statements of work. One recent negotiation process we completed took 4 rounds. It lasted about 9 months from negotiation to execution. In each round, the government specified the changes they wanted to see both in the scope and the budget. And so it's like a little mini proposal that we're submitting. And they do set a deadline that revised submission is due for each round of negotiations. And then the results of the negotiations is our final proposal, which will form the basis of the awarded contract. Next slide, please. Okay, so, we've concluded negotiations, the award has been issued, now what? Okay, so the final contract should reflect the final negotiated proposal, but OSP will review for accuracy, will obtain PI approval, particularly approval of the final statement of work or scope of work and budget. Once OSP executes the contract, we will schedule, this is what Janet was talking about, we will schedule another internal kickoff meeting for the award. And this will include all relevant stakeholders, which typically is RGC, OSP, PI, the PI and the project team, the RAS, IT, and we're going to go over any contract requirements so that we can ensure compliance throughout the life of the contract. And we do that after the award because not all proposals, unfortunately, end up or result in a contract awarded. So we do that once we know we have the award that's executed. The sponsor may also schedule a kickoff meeting, including these same stakeholders. That just depends if the sponsor chooses to do so. And federal contract awards, due to their size and complexity, generally require multiple projects at award setup. Next slide, please. Okay, so during the term of the contract, we may also need to go back and request certain approvals from the contracting officer. These are called contracting officers authorization, or COAs is how we typically refer to them. COAs are typically required when there are changes to the scope of work, the budget, if we have requested travel or equipment purchases that were not previously approved in the contract. Again, keep in mind, this is different from grants where a PI might be able to make some of these adjustments, particularly to the scope or the budget without prior approval. But the terms of the contract will dictate if and when a COA is required. And if there are any doubts, OSP will reach out to the contracting officer just to confirm. And if a COA is needed, the project team will draft the letter and OSP will be the office to sign and submit that request to the contracting officer. Next slide, please. So during the term of the award, there are various reporting requirements that are outlined in the contract. The contract outlines how the reports should be submitted and the frequency. So some reports include technical or progress reports, which can be due at various intervals. They can be monthly, quarterly, biannually. Invention reports address whether an invention was created, and some contracts also require negative reports, meaning that we have to indicate that no inventions were created. Those may be required as well. Reporting is required for any work involving the possession, use, or transfer of select agents, toxins, and or highly pathogenic agents. And if the contract includes a small business subcontracting plan, as Janet described earlier, reports are required quarterly and are completed by our procurement or purchasing team, and they report on our small business spending. And then any other reports that are required as detailed in the contract. Next slide, please. Okay, so Kanika and Janet both touched on past performance and CPARs earlier. So in addition to past performance that may be required to be submitted as part of the proposal, the government maintains a past performance web-based database, which is the Contractor Performance Assessment Reporting System, and you'll hear us refer to it as CPARs. FAR 42, I think it's 15, I can't see that number, 1502 and 1503 require agencies to prepare evaluations of contractor performance and submit them in CPARs. So all information contained in these assessments can be used by the government for future selections where past performance is an evaluation factor, and they're encouraged to do so. OSP's business representative does have the opportunity to comment on, to concur, or to refute the government's assessment of Emory's performance on any particular contract, and these reports can impact, particularly if they're negative, can impact Emory's ability to receive future federal contracts. You can go next 2 slides, please, Trissa. We're going to go to contract closeout. All right, so as the term of the contract nears the end, the contracting officer will issue closeout documentation to formally conclude the contract. It is the final step in the contract life cycle and is important because the federal government cannot settle their financial records until it occurs. And completion of this step signifies that all terms of a contract have been met, all administrative actions have been completed, and all disputes, if any, have been settled and final payment has been made. Next slide, please. And some of the forms that we see during the closeout process are, this is a long one, the contractor's release of claims and or contractor's assignment of refunds, rebates, credits, and other amounts. That form does exactly what it says. It releases the government from liabilities or claims arising out of the contract with some limited exceptions. And it also assigns to the government any refunds, rebates, or credits, including interest, for properly allocable costs for which Emory has been reimbursed by the government under that contract. We'll also see the subcontract settlement form. So if it's applicable, if we had subcontractors, this form verifies to the government that all subcontracts have been settled. The contractor certification specifies whether there was a notice or claim of patent or copyright infringement based on performance of the contract, or whether we received any royalty payments in excess of $250, and also whether there was any inventions or discoveries made by Emory as a result of the performance under the contract. And if there were any inventions made, then we also have to submit a final invention statement. There's the animal disposition form. So if animals were used, we have to let the government know whether the animals expired, retired, or were transferred. And if they were transferred or retired, where did they go? And then the inventory disposal schedule, which that form is used to identify any property that was either acquired by Emory or provided by the government during the term of the contract, to allow the government to determine its proper disposition. Next slide, please. Okay, so tips and best practices for the research administrator. So just a few tips here. Remember, we've stressed it, I think, throughout, this is not a grant. So if your investigator decides to pursue a federal contract, please, please, please notify OSP as soon as you find out. Even if your investigator is not sure they are absolutely going to submit, please let us know early, because as you can see, there's a lot of information to gather and put together for a proposal submission. Remember, this is a collective effort. It involves many stakeholders across the institution and requires that we clearly identify roles and responsibilities at the onset. There are some responsibilities that rest with RAS, such as managing subcontractors and their information, gathering past performance information, and also the final proposal packaging, just to name a few. And so again, that's why it's so important to let us know as early as you can that a proposal submission is likely. And then the final proposal submission package should arrive at OSP at least 3 to 5 business days prior to the agency's deadline. Anything shorter than that results in a less comprehensive review by OSP and will only review the proposal at a high level. And again, last thing I want to say is, as we mentioned earlier, we know that we presented you with a lot of information here. It's very dense, as Trisha and Kanika and Janet, I think we've all said. It's a lot of information. We're not expecting you to be experts after this session. Our goal is just to introduce you to this information, or to provide a refresher for those of you who are familiar with it. For some of the federal, a refresher on the federal contracting process, and to provide you with the resources that you need to navigate this process from proposal to closeout here at Emory. And
Wow, this amazing information.
fine.
Thank you so much. You know, the point that you've made a number of times, that all of you have made about this not being a grant, really for me was hammered home also in the question that Maggie asked about, are COAs required to issue any subcontracts, even if they were included in the proposal? Because if they were included in the proposal, in a grant proposal, we don't have to then go back and get sponsor permission, right? Their permission is in the award. So completely different here. Looking then at Janet's answer, why, yes, even if they were included, you have to get that authority to issue. So very different than the grant process. So thank you all so very much. I know we still have a couple of minutes, so I want to open it up for questions or any additional thoughts that the presenters would like to share.
Any questions, thoughts, previous experiences that you all might want to share or discuss?
Hi, Janet, this is Shinyan.
Hey, Jamia.
I just wanted to, could you elaborate a little bit on exactly what they're looking for? I mean, I know each agency is going to be different, but that closeout document, are they trying to confirm certain things, or can you give us examples of what that might look like?
Sure, absolutely. So those list of forms that Nikki displayed earlier in the in her slides are typical of what we see, right? They want to ensure, first and foremost, that we have invoiced all that we're supposed to against the contract amount that's allocated to us. And that includes if we have subcontractors that have been authorized. So if that's the case, that subcontractor's form also needs to be completed. And what we should have also stressed to you guys is each of those forms, we have to, OSP is the recipient of them, but we have to reach out to various different offices. So, excuse me, the contractor's release is typically completed by the RGC ops team, right? They'll review and verify that they have either submitted all invoices or we've been paid by all the invoices, and they usually sign off on that form and we countersign. Same for the subcontractors. We might need to reach out to the investigator, or we do need to reach out to the investigator to verify if the animals have been disposed and what has occurred, and verify that with IACUC. For inventions, we need to tap OTT and ensure that there were no invention disclosures that was submitted to them, and have them confirm anything that was submitted to iEdison if it's applicable. So they in turn verify for us, and then we're able, OSP is able to sign off on the document. So they're looking for a lot of things, right? And each one of those closeout forms is the way for them to verify that.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll work internally to make sure we have the pieces we need at the very end. But that was very helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I should also stress that particularly with the closeout team there in RGC, we're making it a point to include, you know, folks like Patrick in the conversation early on as well. So absolutely, I think we are definitely learning a lot over the years and trying to make sure that all of our respective offices are doing our piece to ensure a proper, clean closeout. Because I will tell you this, if we sign a form and say, yep, we're done, and we're not, there's no way to go back and recoup monies that are lost. You can't argue for it.
Yeah, and okay, yeah, absolutely. And I just want to make sure we're, the closeout team has access to all those documents. So we'll work internally.
Yes, we absolutely will. One of the other things to mention, and I know we talked about it briefly, was that whole CPARS report. That is our grade at a national level. That grade dictates whether or not Emory can be eligible to continue to get federal contracts in the future. So one investigator's faux pas could mean the institution's downturn. It's a big deal. They are not only grading us on the technical work that an investigator does, but it's how we manage the funds. It's whether or not we're adhering to the small business subcontracting plan that we agreed to. And so the CPARS report is really, really important.
Great. So there are a lot of thank yous and great presentation in the chat. It really was an excellent presentation. This is complicated material, and you all took it and made it so extremely clear. This is one of the best contract presentations I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot of contract presentations. So again, please join me in thanking our presenters for this excellent presentation. We will be sharing the slides out through email. We will also put the slides and the recording in Brainier, and we will share the link to Brainier. So you'll have this information going forward. We rely very heavily on your feedback. So give your kudos in writing, please, by answering the short survey. I've added the link a couple times there to the chat, and we really appreciate it. It should only take just a couple of minutes to complete that survey. So thank you so very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.